The hospital CEO laughed when the old janitor asked him not to tear down the east wing. He thought the man was just another maintenance worker, afraid of losing his job. What he didn't know was that inside a locked file cabinet, 3 floors above them, sat a 35-year-old letter, written by the hospital's own founder, naming that janitor the one person who should decide the building's future. Cut to that same morning, 4 hours earlier. Thomas Hall had worked the night shift at Ashworth Memorial Hospital for 39 years, long enough that most of the current staff assumed he'd simply always been there, a fixture as permanent as the elevators or the vending machines, easy to walk past without ever really seeing. He'd started as a young man barely out of his 20s, back when the hospital was a single brick building with 60 beds and a payroll so thin that half the staff went unpaid some months, and he'd watched it grow, floor by floor and decade by decade, into the 400-bed regional institution it had become, all while never once moving beyond the title he'd started with. He found Grayson Pierce, the hospital's new CEO of exactly 4 months, reviewing blueprints in the East Wing's old records room, the same room Thomas had quietly maintained for nearly 4 decades. "Mr. Pierce," Thomas said, "I heard you're planning to demolish this wing for the new parking structure. I was hoping I could ask you to reconsider." Grayson looked up from his blueprints, taking in the grey janitor's uniform, the mop bucket still parked in the hallway, and made his own assumption before Thomas had finished his sentence. "Let me guess, you're worried this means you'll be reassigned somewhere less familiar." "That's not what I'm worried about," Thomas said. "I appreciate the sentiment," Grayson said, already turning back to his blueprints. "But this wing is a financial liability. Outdated wiring, failing plumbing, square footage that could generate 3 times the revenue as a parking structure. I understand change is uncomfortable, but the decision's already been approved by the board." "There are things about this wing you don't know," Thomas said. Grayson actually laughed at that, not cruelly exactly, but with the specific careless amusement of a man who'd never once had a maintenance worker suggest he might be missing something important. "I run a 400-bed hospital, Thomas. I promise you, I know considerably more about this building than the janitorial staff does. I've reviewed every structural report, every engineering assessment, every dollar this wing costs us in maintenance every single year." "Reports don't tell you everything," Thomas said. "They tell me what matters for a decision like this one," Grayson said, waving a hand toward the blueprints spread across the old records table. "I'm sure you have a lot of memories in this building. I understand that, but sentiment isn't a line item, and this hospital needs to modernize if it's going to keep serving this community properly." Thomas didn't argue further. He simply nodded, picked his mop bucket back up, and left the room, leaving Grayson to go back to his blueprints without a second thought about the conversation at all. Margaret Chen, the hospital's long-time director of administration, found Grayson in his office an hour later, reviewing the demolition timeline, and paused in the doorway with an expression Grayson hadn't yet learned to read after 4 months on the job. "I heard Thomas spoke to you about the East Wing," she said. "He did," Grayson said. "I handled it. Politely, I might add." "Did you?" Margaret said, in a tone that made it clear she doubted that considerably. "Grayson, how much do you actually know about Thomas Hall?" "He's been on janitorial staff a long time," Grayson said. 30-some years, I think HR mentioned once, back when I started." 39, Margaret said. "Since before this hospital had 400 beds. Since before it had 200 beds, actually. Since it very nearly didn't have any beds at all." Something in her tone made Grayson set down his pen. "What does that mean?" "It means there's a file in this building older than both our employment here combined," Margaret said, "that I've never been permitted to open, on instructions from the board that predate my own hiring by a decade. It's in a locked cabinet in the old records room, the same room you were standing in this morning." Grayson frowned. Why would a janitor's employment file require special board authorization? I never said it was his employment file, Margaret said. I said it was a file about him. There's a difference, and I think you're about to find out exactly how large a difference it actually is. Grayson sat with that for a long moment, an unfamiliar and unwelcome uncertainty settling into a morning that had, until then, felt entirely under his control. You're telling me a janitor has a locked, board-restricted file in this hospital's own records room? I'm telling you, Margaret said, that before you finalize any demolition paperwork, you should probably find out what's actually in that cabinet, and why nobody in this building has touched it in 35 years. She hesitated at the doorway before leaving, adding one more detail, almost as an afterthought. My mother worked the front desk here in the 70s, back when this place nearly closed for good. She used to say there were exactly 2 people who kept this hospital alive during that whole mess. Dr. Bennett was one of them. She never told me the second name. She said it wasn't hers to tell. Grayson looked at the demolition timeline, still open on his desk, and for the first time all morning felt something closer to doubt than irritation settle into his chest. He found himself an hour later asking one of the hospital's longest-tenured nurses, a woman named Dr. Patricia Wren, who delivered babies at Ashworth Memorial for over 30 years, whether she knew anything about Thomas Hall's history at the hospital. Thomas, Dr. Wren said, smiling in a way that told Grayson immediately he'd asked the right person. Thomas Hall taught me how to find my car in the parking garage during my very first week here, back when I was terrified and certain I'd chosen the wrong career entirely. He's helped half this hospital's staff through their worst days at one point or another, usually without anyone noticing he was doing it. Do you know anything about his connection to Dr. Bennett? Grayson asked. Dr. Wren considered the question for a long moment. I know they were close, she said. I know Thomas has never once, in the 15 years I've worked alongside him, told a single story about the hospital's early history, even when people asked directly. He always says the same thing. That's not really my story to tell. She paused. I always assumed that was modesty. I'm starting to wonder if it was something considerably more deliberate than that. Grayson thanked her and walked back toward his office, slower than he'd walked toward it that morning, the demolition timeline suddenly feeling considerably less settled than it had 2 hours earlier. Grayson, unwilling to let a janitor's vague warning and his own administrator's cryptic comment slow down a project the board had already approved, decided the fastest way to resolve his own unease was to simply move forward and prove there was nothing to actually worry about. He called a floor meeting that afternoon, announcing the demolition timeline publicly to department heads, framing it as a modernization initiative that would improve patient capacity across the hospital. Several staff members exchanged uncomfortable glances during the announcement, though none spoke up, the particular silence of people who'd worked somewhere long enough to know exactly which battles were worth having with a new CEO 4 months into the job. Thomas, standing at the back of the room with his cart, waited until the meeting ended before approaching Grayson one final time. Mr. Pierce, please, I'm asking you one more time to wait before you sign anything. Thomas, I've made my decision, and frankly, I'm not sure why you feel entitled to keep pressing this, Grayson said, loud enough that several nearby staff turned to look. This isn't your department. This isn't your decision. I'd appreciate it if you'd let me do my job. The room went uncomfortably silent. Thomas didn't argue. He simply nodded, the same way he had that morning, and turned to leave, his mop cartwheel squeaking faintly in a silence that had grown considerably heavier than it had been a minute earlier. Actually, Grayson said, something petty and defensive creeping into his voice now that he had an audience watching, I think it might be best if we reassigned you to a different building entirely, somewhere that doesn't require quite so much personal investment in decisions above your position. A quiet murmur moved through the small crowd of department heads, several of whom had worked alongside Thomas for years, and clearly found the comment considerably crueler than Grayson seemed to realize it was. One nurse near the front, a woman who'd known Thomas since her own first week on the job 15 years earlier, actually put a hand over her mouth. Margaret stepped in before Thomas could respond himself. "Grayson, a word. Now." "Margaret, I'm handling a personnel matter. You're about to make the single largest mistake of your tenure here," Margaret said quietly, close enough now that only he could hear it clearly. "And I would strongly suggest you have that conversation with me before you finalize a reassignment you cannot take back." Grayson hesitated, aware suddenly of exactly how many people in that room were watching him decide what to do next, and for the first time since he'd taken this job, chose to follow someone else's instinct instead of his own. "Fine," he said. "My office. Now." Margaret led Grayson to the old records room herself this time and produced a key he hadn't known existed, opening a locked file cabinet that had, according to the maintenance log, still taped inside its drawer, not been touched since the year Grayson graduated high school. Inside was a single sealed envelope, yellowed with age, addressed in handwriting Grayson didn't recognize. "Open it," Margaret said. "You need to see this before you sign a single piece of demolition paperwork, and before you reassign a man who has more right to decide this wing's future than either of us combined." Grayson broke the seal, hands slower than he wanted them to be, and unfolded a letter dated 35 years earlier, signed by Dr. Elias Bennett, the hospital's founder, a name Grayson knew only from a portrait in the main lobby he'd walked past 100 times without ever really looking at. The letter read, "If one day someone wants to destroy this wing, ask Thomas first, because without him, this hospital would never have existed." Grayson stared at the page for a long moment. "This doesn't make any sense," he said. "Thomas is a janitor." "Thomas was Dr. Bennett's closest friend for over 50 years, Margaret said. "They grew up 3 houses apart on the same street, and 39 years ago, when this hospital was 11 weeks from bankruptcy, about to be seized by the bank and sold for the land alone, Thomas Hall cashed in his own life insurance policy. Every dollar meant for his wife and children after he was gone, and handed the entire sum to Dr. Bennett anonymously on exactly one condition: that nobody ever know where the money actually came from." "The East Wing," Grayson said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces, "was built with that money." "The East Wing is that money," Margaret said. "Every brick of it. Dr. Bennett wrote that letter and locked it away because he knew, someday, some administrator who never knew the history would look at this wing and see nothing but outdated wiring and old plumbing. He wanted to make sure that whoever eventually stood exactly where you're standing right now would have to hear Thomas's name before they tore down the one thing his friend gave up his family's entire security to save." She pulled a second document from the same folder, a handwritten ledger, Dr. Bennett's own accounting of the crisis year. Names and dates and dollar amounts recorded in careful, deliberate handwriting. "There's more in here than just that letter. 2 more near closures over the following decade, both quietly resolved the same way, neither one ever traced back publicly to the man who actually made them possible." Grayson sat with the letter in his hands, and for the first time since he'd taken this job, understood exactly how much he had actually failed to know, and exactly how badly he had already treated the one person in this building who'd earned more grace than anyone. Grayson cancelled the demolition order within the hour, personally, before he'd even finished reading the rest of Dr. Bennett's file, which detailed considerably more of the hospital's early history than the letter alone had revealed. The board convened an emergency session that same week, not to discuss the wing itself, which was now permanently protected under a new preservation order, but to address exactly how a donor of Thomas's significance had gone unrecognized by hospital leadership for nearly 4 decades. Several long-time board members, it turned out, had known fragments of the story for years and had simply respected Thomas's own wish for silence rather than ever pushing the matter themselves. Grayson addressed the board directly during that session, laying out exactly what had happened over the previous week without softening any part of his own conduct. "I mocked a founding benefactor of this institution because I looked at his uniform and decided that told me everything worth knowing," he said. "That's not a mistake I intend to make again about anyone, in this building or outside it." Grayson found Thomas in the maintenance break room 2 days later, and for the first time since he'd started the job, didn't come in with an agenda already decided. "I owe you an apology," Grayson said, "a considerably larger one than I currently know how to give properly." "You didn't know," Thomas said simply. "I never wanted you to. That was rather the entire point of doing it the way I did." "Why?" Grayson asked, sitting down across from him for the first time in 4 months of working in the same building. "Why give up everything and then spend the rest of your life mopping the floors of the place you saved?" "Because Elias needed a friend who believed in what he was building more than either of us needed credit for building it," Thomas said. "And because watching this place stay open every single day for 39 years has been considerably more reward than my name on a plaque ever could have been." The hospital held a small ceremony the following month. The entire staff gathered in the East Wing's main corridor, Grayson standing at a podium considerably more humbled than the man who'd laughed off a janitor's request 6 weeks earlier. "I mocked a man I didn't understand," Grayson told the assembled staff, "because I looked at a uniform and decided I already knew everything worth knowing about the person wearing it. I was wrong in a way that should embarrass me for a very long time. This wing stands today because Thomas Hall gave up his family's entire security to save it and asked for nothing in return except that it be allowed to keep existing." A new plaque was unveiled beside the wing's entrance that afternoon. Bronze, simple, exactly the way Thomas had quietly requested when the board insisted on some form of public recognition at last. It read, "Thomas Hall, the quiet man who saved this hospital." A young reporter covering the ceremony asked Thomas afterward whether it felt strange to finally be recognized after 39 years of choosing not to be. Thomas considered the question for a long moment, looking at the plaque, at the wing still standing exactly the way his best friend had once dreamed it would, decades after that friend had passed and left him to quietly protect it alone. "I didn't do it to be recognized," he said. "I did it because Elias needed someone to believe in him when believing cost something real. I think, if he were here today, he wouldn't want this plaque to be about me at all. He'd want it to remind people that the person who saves something is very rarely the one making the loudest noise about it." His granddaughter, standing nearby with the rest of his family, asked him later that evening whether he was finally glad the truth had come out after so many years of silence. "I'm glad the wing is still standing," Thomas said. "Everything else, the plaque, the apology, all of it, I could have lived my whole life without. I only ever wanted it to still be there for the next person who needed it." He looked out at the wing one more time, the same corridor he'd mopped for nearly 4 decades without a single soul knowing what those floors had actually cost him. "That was always just extra," Thomas said quietly. "If you've ever quietly given up something enormous and never once asked to be thanked for it, tell us in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one.